Picture this. You're stripped of your name. You're just a number. Your daily meal is a crust of bread and soup that's little more than hot water. You watch the person next to you get waved to the left, toward the gas chambers, simply because they looked weak. The stench of death is constant. The question isn't, will I die? But, will it be today? In that environment, Dr. Viktor Frankl, a prisoner himself, noticed something fascinating. It wasn't the physically strongest who always survived. He saw men who, by all accounts, should have been broken, but weren't. And he saw others, seemingly healthy, who would one day just lie down, refuse their bread, and wait for the end. They lost their why. Frankl realized that the one thing that couldn't be taken away was the reason to live. The will to live wasn't just a vague instinct, it was a conscious choice tied to a purpose. But whether it was the love for a spouse, the desire to finish a great work, or even just the profound need to see the sunrise one more time. And he found that if a man has that why, he can endure almost anyhow. Okay, let's unpack this incredible starting point. The mission today is to take Viktor Frankl's radical theory logotherapy born from the unimaginable horror of the concentration camps and trace its path. First, into modern clinical psychology as a treatment for existential burnout in the corporate world. Second, to the cutting edge of neuropsychology and trauma recovery. And third, we also need to grapple with the complexities and critiques of his historical legacy and the narrative he constructed.
It's quite a journey, isn't it? Taking an idea forged in, the absolute worst conditions imaginable.
Right.
And seeing how it applies today in often very different settings. But that foundation Frankl laid, it was critical and honestly quite revolutionary for his time.
He wasn't afraid to challenge the big names like Freud and Adler.
Not at all. He proposed this thing he called the will to meaning as the primary human drive. And that immediately put him, at odds with the mainstream.
Because Freud was all about the pleasure principle.
Exactly. The will to pleasure, or push for gratification, reducing tension. And then Adler, his focus was the will to power, this striving for superiority, overcoming feeling inferior.
But Frankl said, hang on, those aren't the main event.
Right. He argued they're more like secondary needs. What happens is when our will to meaning gets frustrated, then we might fixate on pleasure or power as sort of a compensation. But deep down, fundamentally, what we're searching for is purpose, significance.
So if you peel back those layers, the core engine driving us, according to Frankl, is this search for meaning. What happens if that engine just stalls, runs out of fuel?
Well, that's when we hit what he famously termed the existential vacuum. This isn't your standard neurosis, driven by internal conflicts like Freud talked about. It's something different. It's this deep, pervasive sense of meaninglessness.
A kind of apathy, loss of drive.
Precisely. Loss of initiative, apathy, just this profound inner emptiness. Frankl saw this happening more and more as traditional anchors form, meaning things like religion, strong community ties, stable family structures started to erode in the modern, secular, industrialized world.
So this vacuum started becoming the main challenge.
He believed so. He thought it was replacing those traditional neuroses as the defining mental health issue of the 20th century. And, well, it seems even more relevant now in the 21st. People aren't just struggling with conflicting desires anymore. Sometimes they're struggling to find any desire, any real purpose at all.
Okay, so to really get how logotherapy works, we need to understand Frankl's view of the person. It wasn't just mind and body, was it? He added something more.
That's right. He talked about 3 dimensions of human existence. There's the physical, the somatic sphere, that's our biology, our body, instincts, all that.
Standard stuff.
Then there's the mental or psychological sphere, our emotions, our drives, how we're conditioned, our psychological makeup.
Okay.
But the crucial 3rd dimension, the one logotherapy really focuses on, is the noetic sphere.
The noetic, it sounds like mind, but you're saying it's deeper than just intellect.
Much deeper. Think of it as the spiritual or existential dimension. It's where our consciousness resides, our sense of responsibility, our freedom to choose, our moral compass. And here's the vital part. Frankl insisted this noetic dimension is fundamentally independent of our body and our psyche.
Independent. Why is that separation so important?
Because that independence is what grants us our uniquely human capacities. Specifically, 2 key things: self-distance and self-transcendence.
Self-distance. That sounds like the key to surviving trauma, like he did. Being able to step back.
It's the absolute bedrock of human agency, yes.
Yeah.
Self-distance is the ability to, step outside yourself, to look objectively at your physical state, your pain, your exhaustion, or your psychological state, your fear, your anger.
Like he described doing in the camps, mentally lecturing about the experience while experiencing it.
Exactly that. It's recognizing, okay, I am suffering right now. But understanding that the suffering is something I am experiencing, it doesn't define the core of who I am. It doesn't erase my worth or dictate my entire future.
It gives you that tiny space between the stimulus and the response.
Precisely. It allows you, whether you're a prisoner then or, say, someone striking a miserable job today, to choose your response rather than just blindly reacting to the pressure you feel, be it physical or emotional.
So if I'm furious because my project got canceled, self-distance lets me see the fury, acknowledge it, but not necessarily, fire off an angry email immediately.
That's a perfect modern example. You create that space for choice. Now contrast that with the other capacity, self-transcendence.
If self-distance is looking inward to get perspective, self-transcendence is looking outward.
Exactly. It's about connecting with something beyond yourself, a purpose, a cause, another person you love, a task that needs doing.
Finding meaning outside of your own skin, basically.
That's the essence of it. Frankl argued this is what truly makes us human. We're not meant to be navel-gazing creatures solely focused on our own internal states or self-actualization. We find meaning when we direct ourselves toward something or someone greater than ourselves.
So if you're only chasing your own pleasure or power or even just trying to find yourself without looking outward,
you risk falling right into that existential vacuum.
Yeah.
You're ignoring the fundamental human drive of the noetic dimension, which pulls us toward connection and purpose beyond the self.
So logotherapy isn't just about feeling better inside your own head. It's about fundamentally shifting your focus off yourself.
That's a huge part of it, yes.
Yeah.
And understanding that helps us see the difference between, let's say, real, authentic meaning and the things we often chase today thinking they'll bring fulfillment.
Like what? What's the fake stuff?
Well, Frankl's successors, people like Alfred Lengel, help clarify this. They talked about how meaning is fulfilled by realizing values. These could be creative values, what you contribute, experiential values, what you receive from the world like love or beauty, or attitudinal values, your stance toward unavoidable suffering.
So meaning isn't some single grand destination.
No. Lengel defined existential meaning as the most valuable possibility in the actual situation. It's very context dependent. It's fluid, discovered moment by moment.
How do you know if you've found it? Is there an internal signal?
Yes. The signal is a feeling of inner fulfillment. It's not just happiness, it's deeper. It's this sense that what you're doing resonates with your core values. And this feeling is incredibly powerful. It's what gives you the psychological resilience, the energy to push through fatigue and setbacks. When you feel that inner fulfillment, the activity itself is the reward.
Okay, let's pivot back to that modern corporate environment you mentioned. This brings us to the danger zone. Pseudo meaning or pseudo motivation. If inner fulfillment is the real deal, what's the counterfeit version?
Pseudo meaning. This might be one of the biggest psychological traps in high-pressure jobs today. It looks like engagement, but it's hollow. It means you're pouring yourself into something, working crazy hours, maybe, but not because you value the task itself.
If you're doing it for other reasons.
Exactly. External secondary reasons.
Yeah.
The big paychecks, the fancy title, getting praise from the boss, maybe just fulfilling duties because you feel obligated or afraid of failing.
So let's take your example. A doctor saving a life because they deeply believe in healing, that's fulfillment. But a doctor doing the same procedure just to pay off massive debts or maintain status, that's pseudo-meaning.
That captures the distinction perfectly. When the motive is, let's say, foreign to the activity itself, it creates this psychological disconnect, this gap. Your mind isn't really on the patient or the problem you're solving. It's focused on the bonus, the promotion, the external validation.
Which means even if you get all those external rewards, there's no real inner satisfaction. Zero fulfillment.
Precisely. And because there's no inherent pull towards the work's value, the person starts to feel pushed. Pushed by deadlines, pushed by duty, pushed by the need for money. They're not attracted by the meaning of the work itself.
And that's just not sustainable, is it?
Highly unsustainable.
Yeah.
Eventually, the external rewards might not seem worth the cost anymore, or maybe they just dry up. And when that happens, the whole structure built on pseudo-meaning just collapses. The result. That existential vacuum we talked about experienced as burnout, emptiness, cynicism.
Which leads us straight into burnout syndrome. Frankl's framework seems tailor-made to understand this, not just as being tired, but as a full-blown existential crisis.
Absolutely. If the existential vacuum is this underlying potential for meaninglessness, and if pseudo-meaning is fueling so much of modern work life, then burnout is almost the predictable outcome when those two collide under pressure.
So how do we typically define burnout clinically? before we add the logotherapy layer.
Well, the standard definition, like the one from Maslach and Jackson, sees burnout as a state of total exhaustion linked specifically to work stress and conditions. It usually involves 3 key symptoms.
Okay, what are they?
First, there's emotional exhaustion, feeling completely drained, like you have nothing left to give emotionally. Second, depersonalization, or cynicism, starting to treat people like colleagues or clients, almost like objects, becoming detached, cynical.
Losing that human connection.
Exactly. And third, feelings of inefficiency or lack of accomplishment. This sense that you're not effective anymore, that your work doesn't matter, or you're just not good at it.
But logotherapy argues it's not just about being physically or emotionally drained.
It goes much deeper. From a logotherapy perspective, burnout is essentially a specific work-triggered manifestation of that existential vacuum. The loss of meaning, the frustration of that will to meaning, isn't just a side effect of the stress. It's a core defining feature of the burnout experience itself.
So if you're trying to figure out if someone is truly burned out versus just stressed or maybe depressed?
The presence of a deep crisis of meaning and values is often the key differentiator. Ask someone in the throes of burnout why they're doing what they do, and often they can't give you an answer that feels genuine or satisfying even to themselves. The why has vanished.
Wow. That really ups the stakes. We're not just talking about needing a vacation. We're talking about a potential collapse of someone's professional identity and purpose.
And the consequences can be devastating. We see it in extreme forms, like the Carducci phenomenon in Japan, literally overwork death from strokes or heart attacks due to exhaustion. But even in Western contexts, it's often a kind of slow psychological deterioration.
People can look successful on the outside,
while being completely hollowed out inside, feeling trapped, helpless, often hiding feelings of guilt or failure. It makes it incredibly difficult for loved ones or colleagues to even notice until things are quite advanced.
And it doesn't happen overnight. That's what's so scary about the progression outlined by Freudenberger and North. It's a slow burn, sometimes over years.
Yes, their 12 phases really capture the insidious nature of it. It creeps up on you. And the scary part is how it starts. It often looks like high performance, even virtue.
Okay, let's walk through those phases. Phase 1. The compulsion to prove oneself. Sounds positive, right?
It does. It starts with enthusiasm, maybe taking on way too much responsibility, feeling like you're the only one who can do it right. It's about validating your worth through work.
And then the praise you get for being so dedicated just feeds right into phase 2, working harder.
Exactly. You double down. You find you can't switch off. Work creeps into evenings, weekends. Relaxation feels like a waste of time or even makes you anxious. You try to solve the mounting pressure by just working more.
Which inevitably starts impacting your physical well-being. Phase 3, neglecting needs.
Yep. Sleep suffers. Eating habits go out the window. You skip exercise. Social life starts to shrink. You're basically trading your health and personal life for perceived productivity, consciously or not.
Now we start getting into the psychological defenses. Phase 4, displacement of conflicts. What does that mean?
It means the inner tension, the anxiety, the exhaustion, the feeling that something's wrong. It gets too uncomfortable to face directly. So you repress it, but it doesn't go away. It bubbles up as general nervousness, maybe feeling vaguely threatened or panicky, often without an obvious cause. This is a critical point, just before your whole value system starts to warp.
And that warping happens in phase 5, revision of values. This sounds like a major shift.
It's huge. Work becomes the only thing that truly matters. Everything else, friends, family, hobbies, personal health, values you used to hold dear, gets devalued. They're seen as irrelevant, distractions, or even obstacles to the real goal, which is succeeding at work. The pseudo meaning has completely taken over your perspective.
That tunnel vision must make it easy to ignore the warning signs. Phase 6, denial of emerging problems.
Total denial. You'd become more intolerant, maybe aggressive, definitely cynical. That's the depersonalization kicking in. You blame everything else for your stress. The boss, the clients, the system, the workload. It's never your reaction or your choices that are the problem. You resist any suggestion that you need help or need to change.
This pushing away must lead to phase 7, withdrawal.
Social life pretty much evaporates. You isolate yourself. And often this is where you start seeking external ways to cope or numb the internal pain, maybe drinking more, using drugs, excessive gaming, compulsive behaviors, anything to avoid confronting that growing emptiness and the value conflict you've created.
By phase 8, the changes are noticeable to others, right? Odd behavioral changes.
Yes. Now, friends, family, maybe close colleagues, they're starting to get genuinely worried. They can see you're not yourself. But because you're stuck in that denial phase, you often react defensively, maybe angrily, pushing away the very people trying to help. which leads to even more isolation.
Phase 9 sounds particularly chilling, linking back to Frankl's ideas. Depersonalization.
This is a profound loss. It's losing that capacity for self-distance and connection. You start seeing yourself and others almost as objects, cogs in a machine. You lose touch with your own needs, your own feelings, your intrinsic worth, and you lose the ability to see the humanity in others too. It's like becoming purely functional, driven by external pressures, a really terrifying loss of self.
And after that loss of self comes phase 10, inner emptiness. Feeling hollow. How do people try to fill that void?
Usually with desperate, often compulsive short-term fixes. Binge eating, compulsive shopping, risky behaviors like casual sex, maybe escalating substance use. Anything to get a momentary hit, a fleeting sensation to distract from the vast, aching emptiness left by the absence of real meaning.
Which inevitably leads to phase 11, depression.
Yes. Now the feelings are overwhelming. Feeling lost, utterly exhausted, hopeless. The future looks bleak, dark, pointless. The classic symptoms of the existential vacuum, apathy, meaninglessness are now front and center.
And the final stage, phase 12, burnout.
The end point, total mental and physical collapse, often requires serious medical help, time off work, intensive therapy. What began with perhaps admirable enthusiasm ends in complete breakdown, and you see the direct parallel. The main symptoms Frankl described for the existential vacuum, that emptiness and meaninglessness. They perfectly describe the psychological state in the later stages of this burnout progression.
Wow. Walking through those stages really highlights why it's so easy to mistake burnout for just depression or simply being overly stressed. How do we keep that distinction clear, especially since the symptoms overlap so much near the end?
It's really important for treatment, actually. While burnout and clinical depression often show up together, the key difference is usually the context. Burnout, as defined by the WHO, for example, is an occupational phenomenon. It's fundamentally tied to the work situation.
Whereas depression is more pervasive, affecting everything.
Generally, yes. Clinical depression tends to be context-free, coloring all aspects of a person's life, not just work. Someone with burnout, at least until the very final stage, might still find some pleasure or meaning in non-work activities, their family, a hobby.
And Frankl's ideas offer another clue here.
Yes, a subtle but important one. Even severely burned out individuals often retain a kind of baseline will to live. They might feel hopeless about work, but usually there's still some spark, some connection to life outside that sphere. This isn't always the case in severe major depression, where the will to live itself can be dangerously diminished.
Okay, and what about differentiating it from just high stress? People use stressed and burned out interchangeably all the time.
They do, and it's a mistake. Stress typically leads to a state of hyperactivity. Think urgency, feeling overwhelmed, maybe physical symptoms like tension, headaches, high blood pressure. You're still fighting.
But burnout is different.
Burnout leads more towards hypoactivity emotionally. Hopelessness, helplessness, apathy, emotional blunting. You stop fighting. You feel defeated. Stress can certainly accelerate the path to burnout. It's a major contributing factor. But stress alone doesn't cause it.
So stress coupled with meaning can be sustained.
Absolutely. Think of emergency room doctors, firefighters. High stress, but often high meaning and positive feedback from the work itself. That can be sustainable, even energizing. The real danger is work stress without that sense of purpose, without positive reinforcement, without intrinsic value. When the why disappears, that's when the stress becomes truly toxic and corrosive, leading down the path to burnout.
Okay, so if the root problem is this void, this lack of meaning, then the standard corporate wellness programs, mindfulness apps, yoga classes, stress management workshops, they're probably missing the mark, aren't they?
They often are, yes. They're treating the symptoms usually in the physical or psychological realms, but they're not addressing the core noetic or existential issue.
They're like putting a bandage on a deep wound.
Exactly. Relaxation techniques might make the emptiness feel slightly less uncomfortable for an hour, but they don't fill the void. They don't restore a sense of purpose.
So logotherapy points to a different kind of solution, a different kind of prevention.
It demands a radical shift in focus towards actively cultivating and increasing the sense of meaning at work. The absolute best prevention for burnout is experiencing genuine inner fulfillment in what you do, doing a job because you find it inherently interesting, valuable, engaging.
When the motivation comes from the task itself.
Right. If your intention is directed towards the work's value as you perceive it, then you're intrinsically motivated. And when that's the case, the risk of burnout plummets, even if the external demands or workload are high.
Now, here's where we need to be careful, right? The source material warns against confusing this deep fulfillment with just like initial excitement or idealism.
This is a critical distinction, especially for passionate, driven people. Raw enthusiasm or idealism, while seemingly positive, can actually be a fast track to burnout if it's not grounded realistically. Well, the idealist often has unrealistic expectations. They might expect constant success or think their passion alone should overcome all obstacles. They might tie their entire self-worth to achieving a specific, often lofty outcome.
Like expecting their first project to change the world.
Exactly. And when reality inevitably hits setbacks, failures, compromises that crash for the pure idealist can be devastating. Their enthusiasm evaporates, often slipping directly into cynicism and disillusionment, because their meaning was tied solely to the success, not the process or the inherent value of the effort itself.
But someone with genuine inner fulfillment responds differently to failure.
Yes, because their sense of meaning isn't solely dependent on the external outcome. They find value in the striving, in the act of creating, serving, or learning itself. So failure is a setback, may be painful, but it doesn't negate the inherent worth of the activity. They have more resilience because the meaning is internal.
So internal meaning makes failure a detour, but external meaning makes failure a dead end.
That's a great way to put it. The person heading for burnout approaches work utilitarily. It's just a means to an end, whether that end is money, status, escaping boredom, whatever. That utilitarian mindset poisons the well of engagement, leading to that inner hollowness that eventually consumes them. Logotherapy aims to replace that external utilitarian drive with an internal, value-driven purpose.
This naturally leads us from the individual struggling with burnout to the role of the organization itself. You mentioned earlier how, in our more secular age, work has taken on this huge burden of providing meaning that maybe religion or community used to provide.
It has, and that puts immense pressure on jobs to fulfill existential needs they might not be designed for. When they inevitably fall short of these often unrealistic expectations, you get widespread frustration, disappointment, and yes, increased burnout risk.
And organizations are starting to realize they can't just ignore this.
They can't afford to. Employees aren't just cogs, they have agency. They can choose to bring their full creativity, energy, and knowledge to work, or they can choose to withhold it, to just go through the motions. And smart organizations understand that getting that full engagement, that willing cooperation, hinges on tapping into that fundamental human search for meaning.
So how do you take Frankl's philosophy and apply it at an organizational level, especially during times of stressful change? This brings us to the Logo-OD framework.
Logo-D, or logotherapy in organizational development, is about using these core principles to frame change in a way that resonates with employees' need for meaning, thereby reducing resistance and fostering buy-in. But, and this is crucial, it has to be done with absolute integrity.
Okay, I have to push on that. Isn't there a huge risk here? Are we just giving corporations fancy philosophical language to manipulate employees into thinking their mundane job is some grand spiritual quest just to get more productivity out of them?
That is the absolute core ethical tightrope, and you're right to raise it. If Logo-OD is used cynically, just as a tool to dress up exploitation with purpose-driven language, it will backfire spectacularly. It will breed even more cynicism and burnout.
So how does the framework protect against that manipulation?
Frankl's own principles offer a kind of built-in safeguard, particularly the concept of hyperintention.
Hyperintention. That's the idea that trying too hard to force something actually prevents it from happening.
Exactly. If you try too hard to force happiness, you can't achieve it. If an organization tries too hard to force employees to feel positive about a change or to force them to find meaning, it guarantees resistance. So the goal of genuine Logo-D isn't to directly drive the change or manufacture meaning.
What's the goal then?
The goal is to focus on creating the conditions and the context where employees can discover meaning for themselves within the change. If the organization's goals are genuinely aligned with broader values, and if the change process is handled ethically, then positive attitudes and readiness for change become a natural side effect, not the forced objective.
Okay, let's look at how those specific logotherapy principles get used to frame change. You mentioned 5 key ones in the research.
Right. First, obviously, is the will to meaning. Since this is the core human drive, any change initiative needs to be framed so employees can see genuinely how participating contributes to their search for meaning. This isn't just slogans. It's about connecting the what of the change to a believable why.
Can you give an example of that reframing?
Sure. Instead of just saying, we're implementing new software to cut costs, The framing might be, this new tool will automate tedious tasks, freeing up our team to spend more time collaborating on innovative solutions for our clients, which is core to our mission of X. See the shift from a purely operational goal to one linked to value and purpose.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second principle?
Values. Changes need to be presented as opportunities for employees to express their values. This can be creative values, allowing them to contribute ideas, innovate within the new process, or experiential values fostering connection, teamwork, and community during the potentially disruptive change period. Change shouldn't feel like it strips away value. It should enable it.
And the third, self-transcendence, connecting to something bigger.
This is vital for getting buy-in beyond self-interest. The framing needs to clearly show how the change and the organization's goals overall serve a larger purpose benefiting customers, the community, society, whatever is authentic. This allows employees to put the collective good, the transcendent goal, ahead of their personal comfort or attachment to the old way. Think healthcare workers. During a crisis, they transcend personal risk for the patient. Leaders need to articulate that larger why.
Fourth principle, no dynamics.
That's not dynamic. It refers to the inherent tension between what is and what could be or what ought to be. In change management, it means challenging the status quo. The framing needs to communicate that past achievements, the meaning found yesterday, isn't enough to guarantee future success or relevance.
So you can't rest on your laurels.
Exactly. It prevents complacency. You emphasize the potential meaning yet to be fulfilled, the next challenge, the next innovation, the evolving needs we need to meet. This creative tension drives growth, similar to how Kurt Lewin's change model talks about unfreezing the current state by highlighting the need for change.
And finally, the fifth principle uses the flip side, the existential vacuum.
Right. To create what change agents call a felt need for change, you have to honestly illustrate the negative consequences of not changing. This isn't just about fear-mongering or threatening jobs. It's about painting a realistic picture of what happens if the organization doesn't adapt, maybe becoming irrelevant, unable to serve its purpose, and therefore unable to provide that sense of identity, community, and yes, meaning for its employees. It frames the change as necessary for the existential survival of the collective they belong to.
So Logo OD provides this philosophical map for navigating change by focusing on meaning. But framing is one thing. Where does this meaning actually get experienced by employees day to day?
The research makes a useful distinction here between finding meaning in work and finding meaning at work. They're different, but ideally work together.
Let's start with meaning in work. That sounds like it's about the job itself.
Exactly. It's tied to the specific roles people play in what one does. Organizations foster this primarily through good job design. Things like increasing skill variety, giving people real autonomy over their work, making sure they can see a task through from beginning to end, past identity and significance. It's also about genuine employee involvement, empowerment.
Feeling like your actual tasks matter and you have some control.
Right. And leadership plays a role here too, through what's called path goal leadership. Basically making it clear how an employee's effort leads to performance and valued outcomes, and removing obstacles that get in the way. Ultimately, meaning in work is often experienced when someone sees their job as a calling. The fulfillment comes directly from the nature of the work itself.
Okay, so that's the task goal. Well, what about meaning at work? This feels more about the environment.
Precisely. Meaning at work is about organizational membership. It's finding meaning in whom one surrounds oneself with, the community, the colleagues, and the shared values, beliefs, and mission of the organization as a whole. This is all about the organizational culture.
How do companies build that?
By intentionally cultivating strong organizational identities and cultures that embody shared meanings, by promoting practices that build real community and supportive relationships, and by championing missions that genuinely aim for values beyond just profit or survival.
So meaning in work is about my job. Meaning at work is about our collective purpose and community.
You got it. And the type of leadership needed for meaning at work is often different. Transformational leadership is key here. Leaders who tap into employees' higher needs, articulate an inspiring vision, using that no dynamics tension, and motivate people through shared purpose, not just rewards and punishments.
And when an organization manages to foster both meaning in the job and meaning at the workplace, what's the result?
The ideal result is transcendence. This is where the employee feels connected to something much larger than themselves, larger than their specific task, even larger than the organization itself.
How do you cultivate something that sounds almost spiritual?
Well, organizations can do it by providing what some researchers call a cosmology a comprehensive belief system, a shared narrative that gives people a sense of direction, purpose, and place within a larger context. It also requires fostering deep psychological safety, especially during change, so people feel secure enough to let go of old ways and embrace new, meaningful identities. And underpinning all of it, absolutely critical, is leadership integrity. Any hint of hypocrisy, manipulation, or that the meaning talk is just lip service.
And the whole thing collapses.
Instantly, trust evaporates, cynicism takes over, and the potential for genuine meaning is destroyed.
We've tracked logotherapy from the depths of the camps to the pressures of the modern office. Now let's shift focus again, down to the very wiring of our brains. Frankl's ideas about choosing our attitude, finding a why, they feel powerful philosophically, but is there actual physical evidence in the brain for this kind of resilience?
There is, and it's fascinating. Modern neuropsychology, particularly through studies of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, is giving us a window into the neural mechanics of resilience and recovery. Neurobiological models basically see PTSD symptoms, the flashbacks, the hypervigilance, the avoidance as reflecting a kind of breakdown in the brain's normal stress response circuitry the system gets stuck on.
So if you scanned the brain of someone with PTSD during a trigger, what would you typically see? Where's the malfunction?
Consistently, functional imaging studies show a specific pattern. You tend to see decreased activity in the prefrontal cortex, or PFC. That's the brain's executive control center, responsible for planning, decision-making, inhibiting impulses.
The rational part is offline.
Effectively, yes. And at the same time, you see increased, often dramatically increased, activity in the amygdala. The amygdala is deep in the limbic system. It's the brain's threat detector, the fear hub.
So the alarm system amygdala is blaring, and the control tower, PFC, isn't answering the call.
That's a great analogy. The primitive emotional fear system overrides the higher-level cognitive control. That's what we call impaired top-down regulation. The person gets locked in this bottom-up fear loop, driven by traumatic memories and triggers, and they can't use their PFC to reality check the situation or calm the system down.
Okay, if that's the problem, this specific pattern of brain dysfunction, then successful therapy should change that pattern, right? We should see the brain circuits getting rewired, functionally speaking.
And that's exactly what the research shows. What's really interesting is that different types of effective trauma-focused therapy, whether it's cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, EMDR, prolonged exposure, they often lead to similar changes in brain function.
Suggesting they're tapping into a common underlying mechanism of recovery.
Precisely. The common denominator seems to be neuroplastic changes related to things like extinction learning, unlearning the fear association, habituation, getting used to the trigger without the fear response, and crucially, the restoration of that top-down cognitive control.
Let's break down the changes. First, the emotional centers, the amygdala, the fear hub. What happens there after successful therapy?
You see a significant decrease in activity post-treatment, particularly in the amygdala. Less threat processing, the alarm quiets down. You also often see decreased activity in the insula.
The insula, I know it's involved in bodily awareness, but how does it relate to trauma?
The insula plays a key role in our subjective feeling of anxiety, in processing bodily sensations related to emotion, and in detecting salience, what feels important or threatening right now. In PTSD, it's often hyperactive, contributing to that feeling of constant vigilance, hyperarousal, that knot in your stomach.
So after therapy, less activity in the insula means the body feels calmer, less on edge.
Exactly. It correlates with reduced physiological arousal. And interestingly, some studies show that very high pre-treatment activity in both the amygdala and the insula can actually predict poorer treatment outcomes.
Why would that be?
The thinking is that if these fear and arousal centers are too hyperactive to begin with, the person might be simply overwhelmed during the therapy itself. Confronting the trauma, which is necessary for healing, might trigger too much fear for them to regulate, making it harder to learn new responses and habituate.
Okay, so the emotional centers calm down. Now, what about the cognitive control areas, the PFC, the parts Frankl might say represent our noetic capacity for choice? Which areas ramp up?
Successful therapy consistently shows increased activity in key regulatory regions. Primarily, we see boosts in the prefrontal cortex, PFC, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, DACC, and the hippocampus.
Increased PFC activity that sounds like the control tower is back online.
It is. It reflects regained top-down control, better executive function, better ability to think rationally about the fear, make decisions, consciously regulate emotions instead of just reacting.
And the DACC, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. What's its job and why is it important here?
The DACC is fascinating. It's heavily involved in monitoring conflict, detecting errors, and essentially evaluating the emotional significance of stimuli in context. Think of it as the brain's reality checker for emotions.
So it helps you notice, wait, I feel scared, but am I actually in danger right now?
Precisely. Increased DACC activity reflects an enhanced ability to appraise the situation, recognize the mismatch between the triggered feeling and the current safe reality, and then engage regulatory strategies via the PFC. It's absolutely crucial for exerting that cognitive control, that self-distance Frankl talked about.
So functionally, the DATC is like the neural basis for choosing your response, for taking that stance against the immediate feeling.
That's a very good way to conceptualize it. And finally, we see increased activity in the hippocampus. Why is that important?
Memory, right. The hippocampus is key for memory formation.
Exactly. In trauma, memory processing gets disrupted. Increased hippocampal function post-therapy means better consolidation of memories, putting the trauma correctly in the past, and critically, better contextual learning. It helps the brain learn and remember which situations are genuinely safe now, distinguishing them from the past danger.
And just like high emotional activity predicted failure, can activity in these control regions predict success?
Yes, this is really compelling. While high amygdala insula activity beforehand might indicate a tougher road, several studies have found that higher pre-treatment activity in the DACC, that cognitive control hub, is a strong positive predictor of successful treatment outcome.
Meaning people who already have a stronger baseline capacity for that cognitive self-regulation tend to respond better to therapy.
It suggests exactly that. They seem to start with better neurological resources for engaging with the therapy and achieving that shift from being overwhelmed by emotion to regaining cognitive control.
So tying this back to Frankl and logotherapy, the journey of trauma recovery, neurologically speaking, seems to mirror his philosophy. It's a shift from being dominated by the bottom-up reactive fear circuit
The amygdala insula,
to regaining control via the top-down cognitive regulatory circuits.
the PFC, the DACC, it's the physical manifestation of moving from helpless reactivity to chosen agency, the ability to step back, appraise, and choose your response. Frankl's core idea isn't just philosophy. It's reflected in measurable changes in how the brain functions. It physically rewires pathways towards resilience.
That's powerful stuff. Okay, so we've seen logotherapy's relevance in burnout, in organizational change, and its echoes in neuroscience. But we have to address the source of its immense authority. Frankl's own story, particularly Man's Search for Meaning, it's undeniably one of the most influential books ever written.
Absolutely. It consistently ranks on most influential lists, translated into countless languages. Its power lies in offering this almost counterintuitive hopefulness drawn from the absolute darkest of human experiences.
He managed to find meaning in the seemingly meaningless horror of the camps.
Right. He used his own experience as the ultimate validation, the acid test, as he put it, for his entire philosophy of logotherapy. The narrative is constructed to show how focusing on meaning, on a why, enabled survival and transcendence even there.
But like many powerful narratives based on trauma, it's faced scrutiny. Critics, notably Holocaust scholar Lawrence Langer, have argued that Frankl might have, well, shaped the narrative to fit his theories, that the reality of Auschwitz might have been distorted.
Yes, Langer's critique is significant. He argues that Frankl, perhaps understandably given the trauma, prioritized creating a heroic, instructive story. By emphasizing things like Nietzsche's, quote, "He who has a why to live for can bear with almost anyhow." Langer felt Frankl might have downplayed the sheer randomness, the nihilism, the moral chaos that defined the experience for so many, especially those who didn't survive.
A key point of contention seems to be the actual time Frankl spent in Auschwitz itself.
This is the 3 days issue. Frankl's book opens with his arrival at Auschwitz. He describes the selection process, the shock, the conditions, even specific details like wearing the same shirt for half a year, and positions himself as an expert on the psychological phases prisoners went through there. The reader gets a strong impression he was there for a significant period.
But the historical records, and even Frankl's later accounts, suggest otherwise.
Correct. Records confirm he was deported from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz in October 1944. But biographical evidence, including his own later clarifications, indicates he was only physically present in Auschwitz-Birkenau for about 3 or 4 days before being transported again, this time to Kaufering III, a subcamp of Dachau.
3 or 4 days, that's dramatically different from the impression the book gives. How does that discrepancy impact the reading?
Well, for critics like Langer, it raises questions about the authenticity of the detailed observations Frankl attributes specifically to his time in Auschwitz. For instance, his claim that even the gas chambers lost their horrors for him after the first few days seems problematic if he was only there for a few days himself.
So the critique is that he might have generalized experiences from other camps or ghettos, but anchored them to Auschwitz for greater symbolic weight.
That's the core of it. Auschwitz is the ultimate symbol of the Holocaust's industrialized horror. By centering his narrative there, even if his time was brief, Frankl positioned his experience and thus his logotherapy as having been tested in the absolute epicenter of suffering. Critics see this as a form of narrative stylization, perhaps aimed at bolstering the authority of his theories.
But does the exact number of days really invalidate the philosophical point? If his ideas helped countless people find meaning after the war, does the historical timeline matter more than the therapeutic truth?
That's the crux of the ethical debate. For Frankl, the philosopher and therapist, the meaning derived from the experience, the lesson it offered, was paramount. He was trying to objectify his trauma, to make it universally instructive. His central claim that finding a future purpose was key to survival required highlighting moments of spiritual resistance and choice.
And this focus on choice, on finding meaning in the suffering, is where the interpretation itself becomes controversial for some.
Yes, his account of mentally detaching and imagining himself lecturing is a prime example of his theory in action. But other anecdotes drew more direct criticism.
Like the story he tells of the young woman in the camp who died cheerfully, supposedly grateful that fate had hit me so hard because she'd been spoiled before.
Exactly. Frankl presented this as evidence that suffering offered opportunities for achievement, for realizing moral values. Critics like Langer found this interpretation profoundly troubling, almost offensive. How can being systematically murdered be framed as a hidden opportunity or a chance for moral growth?
It risks minimizing the sheer, brutal reality of the genocide.
That was Langer's point. He felt Frankl's relentless focus on finding meaning, on individual choice and moral values, risks obscuring the absolute dehumanizing, meaningless evil of the Holocaust system itself. Langer even drew an uncomfortable parallel between Frankl's focus on inner attitude and the cynical Nazi slogan over the gates. Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free, suggesting both could, in a way, distract from the external reality of extermination.
It sounds like Frankl's intense drive to find meaning, even there, was perhaps deeply tied to his own process of coping with immense personal loss and trauma.
Almost certainly. He lost his wife, his parents, his brother in the Holocaust. His post-war writing strongly suggests he was grappling not just with grief, but with survivor's guilt and the fundamental problem of life's transience. Logotherapy itself became his tool for healing.
How did his ideas help him process that?
A key concept for him was making the past permanent. He wrote, "Having been is also a kind of being, perhaps the surest kind." By reframing the past not as lost, but as a completed, unchangeable repository of experiences and meanings, he could retain the value of what was lost, including the lives of his loved ones. It helped ease the pain of transience.
It transforms the tragic loss into something enduring.
Yes, it allowed him to find meaning in the having been, even if it was painful. The trauma wasn't just something that happened to him. It was something he actively transcended through his interpretation and choice. This led directly to that powerful ethical maxim he adopted. Live as if you were living for the second time, and as if you had acted the first time as wrongly as you are about to act now.
That's essentially a call for constant self-correction based on potential past regrets.
It is. It channels guilt, whether survivor's guilt or guilt over any perceived failing, not into despair, but into fuel for responsible future action. Every choice is weighed against that imagined past mistake.
He even tried to grapple with the moral complexities of the camps, the choices victims faced, through his playwriting.
Yes, his play Synchronization in Buchenwald attempts this. It controversially draws parallels between the often morally compromising actions prisoners had to take to survive, things like stealing, betraying others, and the crimes of the SS guards. His conclusion was a kind of universal responsibility. Everyone faces choices. None of us starts out as a devil.
This sounds like a difficult argument to make in that context.
It remains highly debated in Holocaust studies. While possibly intended to alleviate survivor guilt by acknowledging the impossible choices, blurring the lines between victim and perpetrator actions is ethically fraught. It seems part of his larger effort to impose a coherent, meaningful structure onto the moral chaos he experienced.
And that ability to impose structure, to objectify his experience almost immediately after liberation by dictating his testimony, that's Frankl in action, isn't it?
It's the ultimate example of his self-distancing capacity. He shaped his narrative very deliberately, very quickly, to ensure it served a purpose. validating logotherapy and demonstrating that the human spirit, the will to meaning, could prevail even over the Holocaust. His legacy leaves us wrestling with that tension between profound philosophical insight and strict historical accuracy. What really strikes me looking back over this whole landscape is the journey of this core idea. It starts in the absolute extreme of human suffering, the conviction that our deepest drive is for meaning. And now we see it mapping almost directly onto the crises people face in context of, well, relative affluence and high pressure.
It's like the fundamental human need remains the same, whether the threat is literal death or a kind of soul death in a corporate environment.
Exactly. Whether you're battling the existential vacuum in Auschwitz or in a modern office experiencing burnout, the underlying dynamic Frankl identified seems to hold. The desperate need for genuine inner fulfillment, for a connection to something valuable beyond the self, moving away from that hollow pseudo meaning.
So, what does this all mean for us? It seems, whether we're looking at the slow, devastating spiral of burnout or the intricate challenges of leading people through organizational change, using something like Logo OD, or even peering into the brain itself and seeing how trauma recovery physically involves regaining cognitive control. That search for existential fulfillment is the common thread.
It really does seem to be the unifying force.
And the ability to find and articulate that transcendent why. It's not just about feeling better or performing better. The neuropsychology suggests it actually changes how our brains work. It shifts us from being passengers reacting to suffering to becoming active agents shaping our experience.
From passive victim to active creator of meaning.
The challenge, then, for all of us, in whatever circumstances we find ourselves, is to be really honest about where our efforts are directed. Are we chasing genuine meaning rooted in values we truly hold? Or are we caught in the trap of pseudo-meaning chasing external rewards that leave us feeling empty? Making sure our lives, our work, feel inherently valuable regardless of the outcome. That seems to be the enduring task Frankl left us with.